Hi there, my name's Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel BandysBooks, and today we are here with a Tag Tuesday video. We're going to be doing the Choose Wisely tag, which was created by MJ over at Reading This Life. The premise of this tag is to pick 3 books that utterly destroyed you and then 3 books that restored you. I definitely tend to be a darker, more moody reader, so I have a lot more books that have destroyed me than have restored me. However, I do have at least a little handful of restorative books, so I think we're safe for completing this tag at least. If, like me, you're also a moody, dark reader, make sure you hit that thumbs up button down below, and let's go ahead and get into the tag. So the first book that utterly wrecked me was a book that I read in February. And I knew going into it that it was going to be brutal. I just underestimated how brutal it was going to be. And that is actually Yellow Wife by Sadiqa Johnson. Wow, what a gut punch of a book. So this book follows a young woman. Her father is a slave owner and her mother is a slave. And at least while her father's alive, she is somewhat protected from brutality. She still witnesses it happening to the other slaves, but she's never directly beaten or treated really bad. She's mostly kept as a house servant and given like light work. When her father dies, however, his wife is very vindictive and vengeful and sells her off to a slave prison. And she witnesses just the most horrible cruelties and atrocities along this journey. She is eventually taken by the head jailer of this prison, and he starts to court her. And this is all about what she has to do to survive. She learns very quickly that she has to make some of the most horrific decisions in the interest of protecting herself and protecting her child. The description in this one, it is on another level. So first of all, we have a character that's super easy to like, and we want to root for her. We want her to find freedom to escape, and you're constantly rooting for her, and then these horrific things are happening to her, and that's hard enough in and of itself. But really the hardest part is the things that she witnesses happening to the other slaves. When she is being transported to this slave jail, and in the slave jail, she sees some things happening that I just can't, they're haunting. There is one scene in particular that I think will stick with me to my end days. And this speaks to Sadiqa Johnson's writing, because you know going into the story that it's going to be awful and depressing and dark, right? But she still manages to shock you and still manages to hit you in the feels and make you just like want to break down and ugly cry. I'm not a big emotional reader. I'm not like I don't cry a lot. I'm not super visible in like my grief, but this was probably the closest I think I've ever come to crying from a book. There is one scene, like I said, that'll just haunt me forever. So that was a book that definitely wrecked me emotionally. The first book that restored me was The House on the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I read this a couple years ago, and it has stuck with me as being something that's so warm and fuzzy and just like really feel good. It follows a gentleman named Linus who is a social worker of sorts, and his job is basically to make sure that kids in foster care arrangements are being treated well. And he's given a special assignment where he goes to school and he has to check in on magical students and make sure they're being treated well, but also that, you know, everything is okay. And he doesn't really know what he's getting himself into when he takes on this position, but we're introduced to a cast of characters that is just impossible not to like. And there is an element of like magic and whimsy to this book that is just so feel good for me. The magic of it felt like some of the books that I really enjoyed as a teenager. It just had a very like nostalgic, warm, happy feeling to me. And so if you're looking for a book to pick you up after reading something really dark and heavy, that would be my first recommendation. The second book that destroyed me would be The Island of Sea Women by Lisa C. Oh my gosh, this is another book that's extraordinarily brutal. Also a book where I knew going in that it was going to be a bit brutal. We're talking about a book that's set in Korea during the Japanese occupation. It's set on Jeju Island, which is famous for its female divers. And this really follows a whole collective of female divers through different points in time. The first half of the story isn't really all that brutal or all that tragic. In fact, it feels very hopeful. But the second half, when the Japanese occupation happens and then post-Japanese occupation, we see some levels of brutality that are just horrific. We see some very, very brutal acts of violence against different parts of the population. We see some extremely cruel treatment towards disabled people, towards people that speak out and protest. And I find them especially haunting because they're things that we know happen in reality. Like maybe the instance in the book is not an actual literal thing that happened, but it is representative of things that did literally happen. And that's what makes it all the more horrific. I remember reading it, and then in particular, this one scene that happens towards the end just sticking with me for days after I finished it. The second book that really restored me was The Guncle by Stephen Rowley. This is a really sweet book, first of all, and it touches on some emotional topics, but it touches on them in a way that is uplifting instead of soul-crushing. So we have the GUP, which stands for Gay Uncle Patrick, and he is someone who very much loves his nieces and nephews, but has been the type of uncle that kind of pops in on occasion for family visits, but isn't really like a primary caregiver. When his brother loses his wife and then struggles with his own mental health crisis, he ends up taking over care of his niece and nephew for a period of time. And at first he's trying to solve everything with like treats and jokes and laughing. And then he comes to realize that sometimes it's not quite that simple. This is such a heartwarming story. It really ends up being a feel-good thing and makes you take a look at your family and want to love them a little bit harder. This is another book that I would highly recommend, like if you're going to be doing a lot of heavy reading where you have a lot of really deep and difficult books, maybe put this in there to break it up and intersperse it a little bit, because this will make you feel like you just read a warm, cozy hug. And book number 3 of books that destroyed me, it was pretty hard figuring out what should be on this list. I feel like there are several books that could really easily fit into this category. I considered The Four Winds by Kristen Hanna, which is extremely depressing. I also considered Beasts of the Little Land by Joo-hae Kim. Finally, I settled on the book Silka's Journey by Heather Morris. So Heather Morris wrote the very popular The Tattooist of Auschwitz, which is an incredibly sad book as well. If you want to talk about another soul-crushing book, this is one that could definitely fit in that category. However, I feel like Silka's Journey is more soul-crushing than The Tattooist. The Tattooist, at least it had moments of like love and care and people doing kindnesses for each other. Silka's Journey is brutality on top of brutality. So we have a character named Silka who survives the Holocaust, right? Survives the Nazi concentration camp, basically is systemically raped and repeatedly violated by a Nazi officer. And she is going to be raped either way, so she uses this officer's affections to kind of protect herself and protect her friends, basically. She bargains away her bodily autonomy for favors for her friends to make sure that, you know, if someone's sick, they're cared for, or to keep them from getting sent to the gas chambers and things like that. So after she leaves the concentration camps, she is captured by the Russians and sent to a gulag. And it is just as brutal. She is basically treated like she was a willing participant and a traitor, and many people believe that she was like essentially prostituting herself, and so she's really looked down upon, and she survives just horrible brutality. And at the end of the book, we find out what the reality of this woman's story is and how long she was in the gulags after being in concentration camps. And to think of her surviving. There's this one scene in the book where a younger prisoner is going to be violated by a Russian soldier. And the women in the book basically explain to her, like, look, this is gonna happen to you either way. You can fight and you can make this a experience where you're injured, or you can tolerate it. They're not even telling her like be a willing participate, just tolerate it, you know? And maybe court this person's affections a little bit, and you might be treated better. He might protect you a little bit, and he might save you from being raped by a whole bunch of soldiers. It is just brutal seeing women having to make choices like that, like basically accepting rape by one person to avoid rape by an entire group. It was just one of those scenes that you read and like you stop and just you go, holy shit. And you stop and think about like what that kind of discussion, like what kind of place you have to be in to have a discussion like that. I just remember it sitting with me in just a really deep place in my soul. And again, it's another thing that's like really stayed in my mind, something that, and again, something that's horrible because it's based in reality. It's not a made up like, oh, we wrote a fantasy and added some stuff that we thought sounded really brutal. This is like stuff that actually happened. These stories are representative of women that had to make these actual types of choices. And for me, that's why it makes it so particularly devastating. And my third restorative book is going to be Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. So this one follows 3 different characters. We have Tova, who is an older woman. She's living on her own, and she's experienced quite a bit of loss. Her son died at a very young age under suspicious circumstances. Some people think he was murdered, some people think he had an accident. They've never found his body, and so there's really no answers. And she's also lost her husband and been on her own for quite a while. And basically all that she has left for her is that she's working in an aquarium, and she forms a relationship with a giant Pacific octopus named Marcellus. Marcellus is our second POV character, and Marcellus is very witty, and his observations of humanity are just so interesting and unique. Then we have a third character who's a younger man, and he's kind of figuring out who he is in his life. He's kind of adrift and unsure of what path he wants to pursue, and all 3 of these characters kind of weave in and out of each other, and it's just so interesting. Had this story not had Marcellus the giant octopus as a character, it might have been a little bit more generic, but I think this inclusion of an octopus as a main character was so clever and just really elevated this book significantly. And while this book does get emotional and it does reflect on some difficult topics, it ultimately leaves you in a feel-good place. It's kind of a found family story as well. And so if, again, you're reading a darker TBR and you needed a break from that, this would probably be a good uplifting pick. So there you have it, my 3 devastating books and my 3 restorative books. I hope that you actually enjoy all of them. So if you like this video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below. Let me know what the most destructive book and the most restorative book that you've read is. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below as well as the notification bell, so that way you never miss a video, and that way we can see each other again soon. Thank you so much for joining. Bye.